On the afternoon of July 20th, 1944, a briefcase packed with plastic explosives sat beneath a heavy oak table inside a wooden hut in East Prussia. Minutes later, it detonated, tearing through Adolf Hitler's map conference and killing 4 men outright. The man who had planted it was already racing for an airfield, convinced that he had just ended the Third Reich. He was wrong. Hitler survived, badly shaken, but alive. And within hours, the officer behind the bomb, Colonel Claus Schenk Graf von Stauffenberg, was dead, shot in a Berlin courtyard by the very regime he had tried to destroy. But Stauffenberg's death was only the beginning of the story. What happened next would consume his wife, his children, his brothers, his mother, his cousins, and even distant in-laws in a campaign of vengeance so total that the Nazi state gave it its own name: Sippenhaft, the punishment of an entire bloodline for the sins of one man. Infants were taken from their mothers and given false surnames. A decorated test pilot was gunned down from the sky. An elderly grandmother died of typhus in an SS run camp. A newborn girl was delivered behind prison walls to a mother who did not know if she would live to raise her. So what really happened to the family of the man Winston Churchill once called the bravest of the brave? In this video, we will find out. So, without further ado, let's start at the beginning. To understand what befell the Stauffenberg family, it helps to understand who Claus von Stauffenberg actually was, because the bomb in the briefcase was the culmination of years of anguish, not a single impulsive act. Born on November 15, 1907, at Stauffenberg Castle in the Bavarian town of Jettingen, Klaus Philipp Maria Justinian Schenk Graf von Stauffenberg belonged to one of the oldest Catholic noble families in southern Germany, a lineage that traced its roots back to the 13th century. His father, Alfred, had served as the last Oberhofmarschall, or Lord Chamberlain of the Kingdom of Württemberg, and his mother, Caroline, descended from the Baltic German nobility of the Uexküll-Gyllenband family, with the celebrated Prussian Field Marshal August von Gneisenau among her ancestors. Klaus grew up alongside his twin brothers, Alexander and Berthold, in a household that prized literature, music and philosophy as much as horsemanship and duty. As young men, the 3 brothers were drawn into the orbit of the mystic poet Stefan George, whose vision of a hidden, spiritually renewed Germany left a permanent imprint on Klaus's worldview. He joined the traditional family cavalry regiment in Bamberg in 1926, and like many young officers of his generation, he initially welcomed Hitler's rise to power in 1933, seeing in the new chancellor a man of decisive action who might restore German pride after the humiliations of Versailles. That enthusiasm curdled over the following decade. Stauffenberg served in the invasion of Poland, then in the campaign against the Soviet Union, and finally in North Africa, where in April 1943 a strafing attack very nearly killed him, costing him his left eye, his right hand, and 2 fingers of his remaining hand. He recovered against considerable odds and returned to duty in Germany, where his growing revulsion at the atrocities being committed in the East and at the reckless criminal conduct of Hitler's leadership hardened into a resolve to act. By the autumn of 1943, he had become the organizing force behind Operation Valkyrie, a plan that used the replacement army's own emergency procedures as cover for a coup against the Nazi state. Valkyrie had originally been designed as a legitimate contingency plan, authorizing the replacement army to mobilize reserve troops across Germany in the event of internal unrest, perhaps triggered by an uprising among the millions of foreign forced laborers then working in German factories and farms. Stauffenberg and his fellow conspirators quietly rewrote its provisions so that, in the crucial hours after Hitler's death, the very same emergency machinery could instead be used to seize control of government ministries, radio stations, and SS and Gestapo headquarters across the Reich, buying the conspirators the window of time they needed to arrest the Nazi leadership and negotiate an end to the war before Allied forces reached German soil. It was an audacious plan that depended on split-second timing and required Hitler to actually die in the initial blast, since only his confirmed death would create the momentary power vacuum the plotters needed to activate Valkyrie's cover story convincingly. Stauffenberg made 2 earlier attempts to detonate a bomb at Hitler's headquarters in July 1944 alone, on July 11th and again on July 15th, both aborted at the last moment because key targets such as Himmler or Göring were not present alongside Hitler. a condition the conspirators had originally hoped to satisfy so that a single blast might decapitate the entire Nazi leadership at once. By July 20th, Stauffenberg had concluded that further delay was untenable given the deteriorating military situation on both fronts, and he resolved to proceed regardless of who else might or might not be present. On July 20th, 1944, at the Wolf's Lair headquarters near Rastenburg, Stauffenberg carried his primed bomb into the briefing hut, left it beneath the table, and departed on the pretext of a phone call. The explosion killed 4 men, but left Hitler alive. The explosion at 12:42 in the afternoon killed Colonel Heinz Brandt, who had inadvertently shifted the heavy briefcase behind one of the thick oak supports of the conference table just moments before detonation, along with 3 other officers present in the room. Hitler himself suffered perforated eardrums, burns, and splinter wounds to his legs, along with temporary paralysis in one arm, but the same oak table leg that had spared him from the worst of the blast also doomed the entire conspiracy to failure. Believing the explosion had certainly killed his target, Stauffenberg talked his way past security at the Wolf's Lair's checkpoints and flew back toward Berlin to help set the coup in motion, only for confusion, hesitation, and poor communication among the Berlin plotters to squander the crucial hours before word arrived definitively that Hitler had survived. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel personally telephoned General Fromm at the Bendler block to confirm Hitler was alive, a call that effectively doomed the uprising before it had properly begun. By that evening, as word spread that the Führer had survived, the coup in Berlin collapsed. Stauffenberg was arrested at the Bendler block, the army headquarters on Bendlerstrasse, and shot by firing squad in the courtyard just after midnight, reportedly crying out either "Long live our sacred Germany," or, according to some witnesses, "Long live secret Germany," a phrase drawn from the mystical vocabulary of the poet Stefan George, whose circle had shaped Stauffenberg's worldview since his youth, as the volley cut him down. He was 36 years old, but if Hitler and Himmler believed that killing Stauffenberg would close the matter, they were sorely mistaken about how far their fury would reach. Within hours, the machinery of Sippenhaft, an ancient Germanic principle of kin liability that Himmler now revived and weaponized, began grinding through the lives of everyone who carried the Stauffenberg name, and many who had simply married into it. Nina Schenk, Grafin von Stauffenberg, born Elisabeth Magdalena Frein von Lerchenfeld, on August 27, 1913, in the town of Kauno in what was then Imperial Russia, was Claus's widow, and her ordeal in the aftermath of July 20th is one of the most harrowing survival stories to emerge from the German resistance. She had married Claus on September 26, 1933, in Bamberg, and over the following decade she bore him 5 children while managing the family's country estate at Lautlingen and following her husband through a string of military postings. Nina knew in general terms that her husband despised the regime, and she quietly shared his moral revulsion, but for her own safety and that of her children, she was deliberately kept in the dark about the specific mechanics of the assassination plot. Only her great-uncle by marriage, Nicolas von Uexküll-Gyllenband, known affectionately within the family as Uncle Nux, and Claus's brother Berthold were fully aware of what was coming. On the afternoon of July 20th, Nina was at the family's rambling summer house in Lautlingen in the Swabian Alps with her 4 young children, her mother-in-law Caroline, her great-aunt Alexandrine, and Uncle Nux, while the men of the family were scattered across Germany and the front. The following day, as news of the failed assassination spread across German radio, Nina gathered her 2 eldest sons and told them, with careful ambiguity, that their father had made a mistake and had been executed as a result, adding that Providence protected our beloved Führer. It was a lie crafted to protect the children from a truth too dangerous to speak aloud, and they would not learn the real story that their father had died trying to kill Hitler for the sake of Germany until the war was over. The blows came swiftly after that. On the night of July 22nd into the 23rd, the Gestapo arrived at Lautlingen and arrested both Nina and Uncle Nux, hauling them off to Berlin for interrogation. The following night, Gestapo agents returned and seized Claus's aging mother, Caroline, along with his aunt Alexandrine, a Red Cross official. The 4 Stauffenberg children, the eldest of whom, Berthold Maria, had just turned 10, were left behind at Lautlingen in the care of a nanny and a housekeeper, watched over by 2 Gestapo officials billeted in the house to ensure no one fled. Nina, meanwhile, was interrogated at Gestapo headquarters in Berlin, a process made especially cruel by the fact that she was heavily pregnant with her fifth child. While in custody, she found herself comforting the wife of the imprisoned communist leader Ernst Thälmann, who had just learned that her own husband had been executed. A small human moment of solidarity amid the machinery of Nazi terror. From Berlin, Nina was transported to Ravensbrück, the notorious concentration camp built specifically for women, where thousands of prisoners were worked, starved and murdered under SS guard. She was held there through the autumn of 1944, and as her pregnancy advanced, she was eventually moved to a maternity facility near Frankfurt an der Oder, where, on January 27, 1945, under armed guard, she gave birth to a daughter she named Constanze, the last child she would ever have with the husband who had been dead for more than 6 months. What became of that newborn daughter and her mother next? The answer involves one of the more remarkable and little-known episodes of the entire Sippenhaft ordeal. As the Red Army advanced from the east in the early months of 1945, Nina and her infant daughter were evacuated westward on a chaotic hospital train, during which both mother and baby contracted an infection that nearly killed them. They were brought under Gestapo guard to a Catholic hospital in Potsdam, where they slowly recovered, and once well enough to travel, they were handed over to a single policeman, with orders to escort them to Schönberg, a town where other Sippenhaft prisoners connected to the July plot were being held. But the war was collapsing around all of them by that point, and the policeman, as Nina later recounted to her son Berthold, considered the assignment beneath him and simply wanted to go home. In a moment that captures both the absurdity and the horror of those final weeks of the regime, he abandoned Nina and her baby in a village, but not before insisting that she sign a certificate stating he had properly carried out his orders. It was there that advancing American forces found her, making Nina, remarkably, the very first Sippenhaft prisoner to be liberated. Though, as she later remarked, no one in a conquered Germany truly felt free in those chaotic days of spring 1945. Reunited eventually with her surviving children at Lautlingen in July 1945, almost exactly 1 year after her husband's bomb had exploded at the Wolf's Lair, Nina spent the remainder of her long life quietly rebuilding what was left of her family and working to foster understanding between Germans and the American occupying forces who had, in the end, been the ones to set her free. She never remarried. She lived to see her husband's reputation transform from that of a traitor, which is how the Nazi regime and many ordinary Germans had regarded him, into that of a national hero, one of the most honoured figures of the German resistance to Hitler. Nina Schenk, Gräfin von Stauffenberg, died on April 2, 2006, at the age of 92, in the small town of Kirchlauter near Bamberg, and was buried there 6 days later. Her youngest daughter, Constanze, the baby born in captivity, would go on decades later to write a best-selling biography of her mother's extraordinary life, ensuring that Nina's own quiet courage would not be forgotten alongside her husband's more famous defiance. But what of Klaus's own brothers, the men who had grown up alongside him under the spell of Stefan George's poetry and the discipline of the old Württemberg aristocracy? Their fates diverge so sharply from one another that together they illustrate just how arbitrary and merciless the machinery of Nazi retribution could be. Berthold Schenk Graf von Stauffenberg, born March 15, 1905 in Stuttgart, was Klaus's eldest brother and, crucially, one of the very few family members who had actually known about the assassination plot in advance. A trained lawyer who had worked at The Hague in the early 1930s before joining the German Navy's High Command as a staff judge and advisor on international law, Berthold was a serious, intellectually formidable man who shared his younger brother's disgust with the criminal direction the Nazi regime had taken. His Berlin apartment on Tristanstrasse, where Klaus also lived for a time, became one of the informal meeting places for the conspirators plotting Hitler's overthrow. When the bomb failed to kill its target and the coup unravelled on the night of July 20th, Berthold was arrested along with his brother at the Bendler block, while Klaus was executed within hours by firing squad, ostensibly to prevent him from revealing further details of the plot. Berthold's fate would be crueler and more drawn out. He was subjected to weeks of Gestapo interrogation, during which he adopted a strategy of calculated evasiveness, revealing as little as possible about the wider resistance network, while the Gestapo pieced together most of what they needed from seized documents and diaries rather than from his own testimony. On August 10, 1944, Berthold was brought before the Volksgerichtshof, the so-called People's Court, a special tribunal Hitler had established specifically to handle political offences with maximum theatrical cruelty. Presiding was Roland Freisler, the infamous judge notorious for turning trials into screaming propaganda spectacles designed to humiliate defendants before condemning them. Berthold was found guilty and, along with 7 other conspirators, was executed that very evening at Plötzensee prison in Berlin by slow strangulation, reportedly with thin cord or piano wire rather than a standard hangman's drop, a method chosen deliberately to prolong the victim's suffering. According to multiple historical accounts, Berthold was strangled and revived several times before finally dying, and the entire grotesque process was filmed on Hitler's orders so that he could watch the executions of his enemies at his leisure. Berthold Schenk Graf von Stauffenberg was 39 years old. He left behind a wife, Maria Mika Klassen, whom he had married in 1936, and 2 young children, a son named Alfred Klaus Maria, born in 1937, and a daughter, Elisabeth Caroline, born in 1939. In a poignant detail that speaks to how deeply the family's story intertwined across generations, Klaus had actually named his own eldest son, Berthold Maria, after this very brother, meaning that when the elder Berthold was strangled to death at Plötzensee, his nephew and namesake, a 10-year-old boy at the time, was simultaneously being torn from his mother and swept into Nazi custody at Lautlingen. Berthold's twin, Alexander Schenk Graf von Stauffenberg, followed an almost unbelievably different path, one defined not by conspiracy but by complete ignorance of what his brothers had been planning. Alexander was a scholar by temperament, a professor of ancient history who had built his academic career studying the classical world rather than plotting against the Nazi state. In August 1937, he had married Melita Schiller, an aeronautical engineer and test pilot whose own story would become one of the most extraordinary threads in this entire tragedy. At the time of the July 20th plot, Alexander was serving with a Wehrmacht unit in Greece, entirely unaware that his younger brother was about to attempt to kill Hitler. It made no difference to the Gestapo. Under the logic of Sippenhaft, guilt by blood was sufficient, and Alexander was arrested in Greece in late July 1944 and eventually transported back to Germany, where he would spend the remaining months of the war as a Sippenhaft prisoner in a series of camps, including a stint at the notorious Dachau concentration camp. Unlike his brothers Klaus and Berthold, Alexander had committed no act of resistance whatsoever, yet he found himself stripped of his freedom, separated from his wife, and held as a hostage against the small chance that his captivity might someday prove useful to the regime, or simply as an act of pure vindictive terror. Against the Stauffenberg bloodline, his experience raises one of the most uncomfortable questions running through this entire story. How do you hold a man accountable for a crime he never knew was being planned? The Nazi state never bothered to answer that question because for Himmler and Hitler, the answer was simple and brutal. The name Stauffenberg itself was now considered a crime. Melita Schenk Gräfin von Stauffenberg, Alexander's wife and Klaus's sister-in-law, deserves particular attention because her life before the July plot was already extraordinary, and her death after it remains one of the most haunting mysteries connected to the entire Stauffenberg saga. Born Melita Schiller on January 9, 1903, in the West Prussian town of Krotoschin, she was the daughter of a Protestant mother and a father whose own family had converted from Judaism to Christianity generations earlier, a lineage that would place Melita in grave danger once the Nuremberg laws began classifying Germans by ancestry rather than religion. She earned an engineering degree from the Munich Institute of Technology in 1927, an exceptional achievement for a woman in that era, and went on to specialize in aerodynamics, working for years at Germany's leading aviation research institutes. She learned to fly in 1929, funding her own training at one of the few schools willing to accept female pilots, and by the mid-1930s she had become one of Germany's most accomplished aviators, eventually earning the honorary title of Flugkapitän, or flight captain, only the second woman in the country to receive it after the more famous Hannah Reich. Over the course of her career, Melita flew more than 2,500 test dives in Junkers Ju-87 Stuka and Ju-88 dive bombers, evaluating dive bombing instruments and equipment at altitudes and stresses that killed lesser pilots. a body of work for which she was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class and the Gold Front Flying Clasp for bombers with diamonds. Her extraordinary value to the Luftwaffe's technical programs became, perversely, her family's shield. When Nazi race investigators discovered her father's Jewish ancestry in the mid-1930s, Luftwaffe officials who depended on her expertise intervened, and in 1941 they successfully persuaded the regime to formally declare her German-blooded, exempting her and her immediate family from the persecution and deportation that consumed so many other German Jews and people of partial Jewish descent. She married Alexander von Stauffenberg in August 1937, meeting the Stauffenberg brothers, including Klaus, through her husband's family in the years that followed. When the July plot failed and the Sippenhaft arrests began sweeping up her in-laws, Melitta herself was briefly arrested in 1944 on suspicion of complicity. But because her test flying work remained militarily indispensable, she was released within days to resume her duties. What she did, with that fragile freedom in the months that followed, was nothing short of heroic. Using her clearance and her access to aircraft, Melitta repeatedly flew to the various prisons and camps where her husband and other Stauffenberg relatives were being shuttled in secret, often with the covert assistance of a sympathetic Gestapo agent who tipped her off to their locations. She brought food, medicine, warm clothing and bedding, at times even hunting rabbits near her own airfield to bring meat to relatives who were being deliberately starved. She flew a Fiesler Storch, a rugged liaison aircraft prized for its ability to land on short, improvised strips, ferrying desperately needed supplies into the heart of a collapsing, vindictive regime that had already murdered 2 of her husband's brothers. In early April 1945, with Germany's defeat now only weeks away, Melitta learned that Alexander had been moved to a school building in the town of Schönberg that the SS was using to hold its most valuable Sippenhaft hostages. On April 8, 1945, flying a small, unarmed Booker BA-181 training aircraft at treetop height along a railway line to avoid detection, Melitta set out either to deliver supplies or, according to some accounts, to attempt an outright rescue of her husband. Near the Bavarian village of Strasskirchen, her aircraft was attacked from above, its fuselage raked by machine gun fire. Melitta managed to crash land the plane, and witnesses on the ground who rushed to help her found her conscious, with what appeared to be a broken leg and no immediately life-threatening injuries. She was placed in a military ambulance and taken towards Straubing, but she died from her wounds within a couple of hours on April 8, 1945, at the age of 42. To this day, historians dispute exactly who shot her down. The most commonly cited version holds that she was mistaken for a military target by an American P-51 Mustang flown by a young pilot named Norborn Thomas, who was hunting German aircraft that day and had no idea a decorated Luftwaffe test pilot, let alone a woman with no combat role, was at the controls. But other researchers have pointed to conflicting evidence, including eyewitness accounts describing German rather than American fighters in the area, and have speculated that Melitta may have been deliberately killed on the orders of SS officials, suspicious that she was using her flights to smuggle relatives, or even the family's remaining valuables, toward the Swiss border. The mystery has never been definitively resolved. What is certain is that Melitta Schenk Gräfin von Stauffenberg, a woman whose engineering brilliance had once shielded her own family from the Holocaust, spent her final weeks risking her life again and again to keep her husband's Stauffenberg relatives alive, and that she died doing it, just 3 weeks before Hitler himself took his own life in a Berlin bunker. She was buried initially near Straubing, but that September her husband Alexander, freshly liberated from Dachau, arranged to have her remains exhumed and transported to the family crypt at Lautlingen, where she rests today alongside the very family she gave her life trying to save. And what became of Alexander himself, the scholar who knew nothing of his brother's plot, yet paid so dearly for sharing their name? In late April 1945, as the war entered its final days, Alexander was among roughly 140 prominent prisoners transferred by the SS from Dachau southward into the Tyrolean Alps, part of a group of high-value hostages that the retreating regime hoped to use as bargaining chips or, some feared, planned to execute rather than allow to fall into Allied hands. Instead, the SS guards abandoned their prisoners as American forces closed in, and on May 5, 1945, Alexander was liberated by the 5th United States Army under General Lucian Truscott. He emerged from captivity a widower. His wife Melitta killed less than a month earlier. His twin brother Berthold strangled to death the previous August, and his youngest brother Klaus shot by firing squad the night the whole catastrophe began. Alexander chose to rebuild his life through scholarship. In 1948, he became a professor of ancient history at the University of Munich, a position he held for the rest of his career, and in 1951 he founded and served as first president of the Commission for Ancient History and Epigraphy, which later became part of the German Archaeological Institute. He remarried in 1949 to a woman named Marlene Hoffmann, but had no further children by either marriage. Alexander Schenk, Graf von Stauffenberg, died relatively young at the age of 58 on January 27, 1964, in Munich, having spent nearly 2 decades quietly honouring his brother's memory through his academic work rather than public political life, a survivor's grief carried mostly in private. If Alexander's survival shows the arbitrary mercy that sometimes crept into the machinery of Nazi terror, the fate of Klaus's mother, Caroline Schenk Gräfin von Stauffenberg, née Uexküll-Gyllenband, shows just how far that machinery was willing to reach in the opposite direction. Caroline was born in 1875 and had spent her life as the wife of Württemberg's last royal chamberlain, raising 4 sons in a household steeped in music, literature, and old aristocratic tradition. By July 1944, she was 69 years old, a grandmother who had already buried her husband years earlier and who now found herself, in the space of a single week, watching her son Klaus executed, her son Berthold arrested and awaiting the same fate, her daughter-in-law Nina hauled off pregnant to a concentration camp, and her 4 youngest grandchildren left essentially orphaned at the family estate. None of that spared her from the Gestapo's attention. On the night after Nina's arrest, agents returned to Lautlingen and took Caroline into custody as well, alongside her sister-in-law Alexandrine, herself an official with the German Red Cross. Caroline was moved through the same brutal network of Sippenhaft detention that had swallowed the rest of her family, and at some point during her imprisonment, she contracted typhus, the same lice-borne disease that killed tens of thousands of prisoners in overcrowded, unsanitary SS camps in the war's final year. She did not survive it. Caroline Schenk Gräfin von Stauffenberg died in captivity in 1945, one of the least publicised but most quietly devastating losses the family suffered. A grandmother killed not by a bullet or a hangman's rope, but by disease contracted in a system designed to work its prisoners and its hostages alike to death by neglect. Her grandchildren would not learn the full details of how she died until much later, but they carried the knowledge of her loss alongside the executions of their father and uncles as they slowly pieced together, over the months and years that followed, exactly what their family had endured on their behalf. Then there was Nicholas von Uexküll-Gyllenband, Caroline's brother and thus Klaus's own uncle, known within the family by the affectionate nickname Uncle Nux. A First World War combat veteran turned businessman, Nicholas had, like his nephew, initially supported the arrival of Hitler's government in 1933, only to grow disillusioned as the regime's true character revealed itself. By the outbreak of war, he had become convinced that Hitler could not be allowed to continue ruling Germany, and it was Nicholas, as much as anyone, who helped push Klaus toward active resistance, urging him as early as 1939 that Germany needed to be rid of its Führer. As one of the very few family members fully briefed on the plot's details, Uncle Nux served as a kind of liaison between the Berlin conspirators and military command structures elsewhere in occupied Europe, lending his decades of army and business connections to the resistance network. He was present at Lautlingen on July 20th, 1944, the only adult in the house who understood exactly what news was coming over the radio that evening, and he was arrested alongside Nina on the night of July 22nd into the 23rd, the very first of the family to be swept up in the Gestapo's dragnet. Nicholas von Uexküll-Gyllenband was executed on September 14th, 1944, one of the many conspirators and suspected sympathisers who followed Berthold to the scaffold in the weeks after the failed coup. He was 67 years old, a war veteran who had survived the trenches of the First World War, only to be hanged by his own government a quarter of a century later for the crime of urging his nephew to save his country from a tyrant. By the time the immediate wave of arrests and executions had run its course in the late summer of 1944, the pattern was already unmistakable. This was not going to be a punishment confined to the men who had actually built and planted the bomb. Himmler had announced at a meeting of regional Nazi party leaders in Posen that the state would now practice what he called absolute responsibility of kin. reviving what he claimed was an ancient Teutonic custom under which an entire family could be declared outlawed for the offence of a single member. He vowed that the Stauffenberg family in particular would be extinguished down to the last member. It was a threat the regime came remarkably close to carrying out. But how do you extinguish a family that includes small children, none of whom could possibly have known what their father and uncles were planning? The answer the Nazi state settled on was almost as chilling as execution itself, and it is where our story turns next, to the fate of 5 children who lost their father to a firing squad, their mother to a concentration camp, and, for a time, even their own names. Before we turn to the children, there is one more cousin whose story belongs in this account because he shows just how far the tendrils of the July plot and the Nazi vengeance that followed it actually spread beyond the immediate Stauffenberg household. Caesar von Hofacker, born March 2, 1896 in Ludwigsburg, was Klaus's cousin through the Uexküll-Gyllenband line, the same family that had produced Uncle Nux. A First World War veteran who had trained as a pilot and later built a successful business career at the steel conglomerate Vereinigte Stahlwerke, Hofacker was recalled to military service in 1939 and eventually posted to Paris, where he served on the staff of General Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel, the German military governor of occupied France. It was in that role that Hofacker became, in the words of one wartime diarist, the real leader of the resistance movement in the West, acting as the crucial liaison between the Berlin conspirators around his cousin Klaus and the parallel plot being organized in Paris. Hofacker also took on one of the most delicate and consequential tasks of the entire conspiracy, attempting to win over Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, to the cause. Using his father's old wartime connection to Rommel as an entry point, Hofacker met with the Field Marshal and secured at least a degree of tacit support for removing Hitler from power, though Rommel stopped short of endorsing assassination itself. When the July 20th plot collapsed, Stülpnagel and Hofacker in Paris briefly succeeded in arresting more than 1,000 SS and security police personnel before word arrived that Hitler had survived, at which point their own coup unravelled just as quickly as Berlin's had. Hofacker was arrested on July 26, 1944, and subjected to brutal Gestapo torture, during which he eventually gave up Rommel's name, information that would ultimately help seal the Field Marshal's fate, forcing him to take poison rather than face a humiliating public trial. Hofacker himself was tried before the People's Court, and in a moment of extraordinary defiance reportedly told the presiding judge, Roland Freisler, "You are silent now, Herr Freisler, because today is about my head. In a year it will be about yours." He was sentenced to death and executed at Plötzensee prison on December 20th, 1944, killed, like Berthold Stauffenberg before him, on a meat hook by slow strangulation. His body was cremated and the ashes deliberately scattered by the regime to prevent his grave from ever becoming a site of resistance memory. Hofacker left behind a wife, Ilse-Lotte, and 5 children, the youngest of whom, Christa, Alfred and Liselotte, were taken by the Gestapo that summer and sent to a children's home in the town of Bad Saxe, the very same institution where the Stauffenberg children would soon be sent as well. His wife and the 2 eldest Hofacker children were themselves imprisoned at Stutthof concentration camp, and it was there, deep in Nazi custody, that they learned Hofacker had been executed. Like so many Sippenhaft families, the Hofackers were not reunited until July 1945, nearly a full year after the plot that shattered their lives. By late July 1944, the pattern of what would happen to the youngest and most vulnerable members of the extended Stauffenberg family had become clear. The children were not going to be executed, but neither were they going to be left with any relative who might shield them. Instead, dozens of children connected to the July 20th conspirators, drawn from families with names like Stauffenberg, Hofacker, Goerdeler, Tresco, and Trott-zu-Solz, were rounded up and transported to a state-run children's home in the small resort town of Bad Saxe, nestled in the Harz Mountains. There, in a chilling bureaucratic touch that speaks to just how thoroughly the Nazi state wanted to erase these children's identities, the Stauffenberg children were stripped of their surname and issued a new one, Meister. 4 of Klaus and Nina's children, Berthold Maria, Heimeran, Franz Ludwig, and Valerie, ranging in age from 10 down to 4 years old, were segregated by age and sex within the home and given no information about what had happened to their parents or their extended family. More than 50 children eventually passed through Bad Sachse and similar facilities, most of them too young to fully understand why they had suddenly lost their names, their homes, and any contact with the adults who loved them. The children later described the disorientation and quiet terror of this period vividly. They understood only that their father had done something that made them outcasts, that the other adults around them regarded them with suspicion, and that even the village priest, one of the few outsiders permitted to see them before the transfer to Bad Sachse, had warned them that hard times were coming. Conditions grew more dangerous still as the military situation deteriorated in early 1945. Beginning that February, the Gestapo began transferring numerous kinship inmates, the euphemism used for Sippenhaft prisoners, from scattered detention sites into an isolation barrack at Buchenwald concentration camp near Weimar, a facility that had been destroyed in an Allied bombing raid the previous August and then rebuilt specifically to house these hostages. More than 50 Sippenhaft prisoners were eventually held there, deliberately kept apart from the camp's general population of political prisoners, Jews and other victims of the regime, because Himmler still hoped they might prove useful as bargaining chips in negotiations with the advancing Western allies. Among those transferred to the Buchenwald isolation barrack were Alexander von Stauffenberg, arrested in Greece and shuttled through several detention sites before arriving there, along with one of his sisters-in-law, a cousin, and some of the extended family's children. As the war entered its final weeks, the SS made a chilling decision. In the spring of 1945, with American forces closing in on the Harz Mountains, plans were drawn up to transport the Stauffenberg children directly from Bad Sachse into Buchenwald itself, a camp where, given the fate that had already befallen so many Sippenhaft hostages, and where mass killings of prisoners were being carried out even in the war's final days, the children might very well have been murdered. What saved them, according to family accounts passed down through the decades, was pure chance. An Allied bombing raid near the nearby town of Nordhausen disrupted the transport, and the plan to move the children into the camp's clutches was abandoned. Instead, they remained at Bad Sachse as the front line rolled over them. On April 14, 1945, the children heard gunfire in the woods across from the home, watched fighter bombers streak overhead, and then saw soldiers with blackened faces emerge from the trees, American troops who had come to liberate the region. A few days later, the town's new American-appointed mayor, an elderly social democrat, walked into the children's home and told them simply, "Now you are free." They had not seen their mother in nearly a year and did not yet know whether she was even alive. With the immediate danger past, the slow work of reassembling the shattered Stauffenberg family began. On June 11, 1945, the children's great-aunt Alexandrine, the same Red Cross official who had herself been arrested alongside Caroline the previous summer and had since been released, arrived at Bad Sachse aboard a Red Cross bus to collect the children and bring them home to Lautlingen, the family estate in the Swabian Alps where this entire ordeal had begun almost exactly 11 months earlier. Back at Lautlingen, the surviving children began to absorb, piece by piece, the scale of what their family had lost. Their father, executed by firing squad, their uncle Berthold, strangled at Plötzensee, their great-uncle Nux, executed that September, their grandmother Caroline, dead of typhus in an SS camp, their aunt Melitta, killed when her plane was shot down while trying to bring supplies to her imprisoned husband, and for a period of agonizing uncertainty, their own mother missing entirely, last known to have given birth in captivity somewhere to the east. Then, within days of the children's return to Lautlingen, Nina herself arrived, cradling the infant daughter, Constanze, whom none of her older children had ever met. The family that had been torn apart across half a dozen prisons and camps was, for the first time in nearly a year, together again under one roof. It is worth pausing here to note that even this reunion did not mean safety in any conventional sense. Germany in the summer of 1945 was a landscape of chaos, hunger and occupation, and the rural Swabian countryside around Lautlingen was no exception. French colonial troops occupying the region were, according to family accounts, given considerable license by their commanding officers to loot and pillage in the immediate aftermath of the German surrender, and terrified villagers in Lautlingen sought shelter with the Stauffenbergs, whom they still regarded, despite everything, as the local aristocratic family with some measure of protective standing in the community. It was an almost surreal epilogue to the family's ordeal. Having survived concentration camps, executions, and a systematic campaign to erase their very name, the Stauffenbergs now found themselves in a strange reversal, offering what protection they could to their neighbours amid the disorder of a collapsed and occupied Germany. One figure whose contribution to this story deserves far more recognition than she typically receives is Alexandrine, Klaus's aunt and a working official with the German Red Cross, whose own arrest alongside Caroline in July 1944 might easily have marked the end of her story within this narrative, yet who re-emerges at the crucial moment nearly a year later as the very person who rescued the 4 eldest Stauffenberg children from Bad Saxe and delivered them safely back to Lautlingen. Alexandrine's Red Cross credentials, ironically, appear to have provided her with just enough institutional protection and freedom of movement, once released from her own period of Sippenhaft detention, to arrange the logistics of a Red Cross bus, secure permission to travel into the American occupation zone, and physically retrieve 4 traumatized, disoriented children from an institution that had spent the better part of a year stripping them of their identity. It is a quietly heroic act that receives only a passing mention in most accounts of the Stauffenberg family's ordeal, overshadowed by the more dramatic stories of Melita's fatal flight, or Nina's own harrowing journey back from captivity. Yet without Alexandrine's intervention on June 11, 1945, the children might have remained in institutional limbo considerably longer, uncertain of their family's fate and increasingly vulnerable to the general chaos and food shortages sweeping across occupied Germany that summer. The broader community of children held at Bad Saxe alongside the young Stauffenbergs deserves a few more words as well, because their collective experience illustrates just how systematically the Nazi regime approached the task of punishing an entire generation for the perceived sins of their fathers. Beyond the Stauffenberg and Hoffacker children already discussed, the home-held sons and daughters connected to numerous other prominent conspirators swept up in the July 20th crackdown, drawn from families whose fathers had been tried, executed, or were awaiting trial before the People's Court in Berlin. These children ranged from toddlers barely out of infancy to young teenagers old enough to understand, at least in broad outline, that something catastrophic had befallen their families, though the institution's staff worked to prevent them from freely sharing information with one another about their parents' specific fates, presumably to prevent the children from organizing any kind of collective psychological resistance to their situation, or perhaps simply because the Gestapo itself often did not bother to keep the children's home fully informed about which parents had already been executed and which remained alive somewhere in the sprawling network of Nazi prisons and camps. Contemporary accounts describe a strange, unsettling atmosphere at the home, one in which caretakers maintained an outward appearance of ordinary childhood routine, complete with lessons, meals, and supervised play, while the children themselves lived with a constant, unspoken awareness that they had been marked as different, dangerous, or suspect by the only government and society they had ever known. Decades later, several of the surviving Bad Saxe children, including members of the Stauffenberg family, gave interviews to historians studying the long-term psychological effects of the Sippenhaft experience, offering rare, direct testimony to exactly what it felt like to be a small child, stripped of your name and your family in the final desperate months of a collapsing totalitarian regime. Let us turn now to what became of each of the 5 children individually, because their lives after 1945 diverged in fascinating ways, tracing a path from the trauma of Sippenhaft through the slow, complicated process by which West Germany came to terms with and ultimately came to honor the July 20th conspirators. Berthold Maria Schenk, Graf von Stauffenberg, born July 3, 1934 in Bamberg, was the eldest of Klaus and Nina's children and had just turned 10 years old at the time of the assassination attempt. As the oldest child, he retained the clearest memories of the ordeal and would later become the family's most frequently interviewed source on what those months of Sippenhaft had actually felt like from a child's perspective. He recalled the strange, isolating atmosphere at Lautlingen in the days after the plot, when even the family's usual playmates in the village were kept away, and the only outside visitor permitted was the local priest who blessed the children and warned them that difficult times lay ahead. He recalled his mother taking him and his brother aside to explain, in careful and deliberately misleading language, that their father had made a mistake, and he recalled the disorientation of Bad Saxe, of losing his name, of not knowing for the better part of a year whether his mother, his uncles, or his grandmother were alive or dead. After the war, Bertold Maria was educated at the elite Schule Schloss Salem boarding school before studying engineering at the Friedrich Alexander University of Erlangen-Nuremberg. In a striking demonstration of how thoroughly the son chose to embrace, rather than run from, his father's legacy of military service to a democratic Germany, Berthold Maria joined the newly established West German Bundeswehr as soon as it was founded in 1956, becoming an officer in a professional army explicitly built on the principle, drawn directly from the July 20th conspirators' own example, that a soldier's obedience has limits when the orders come from a criminal regime. He would go on to serve for 38 years, an extraordinarily long career that culminated in his promotion to command of Territorial Command South and the rank of General Major. Along the way, he commanded Armoured Reconnaissance Training Battalion 11 at Munster in Lower Saxony, at the time Germany's largest military base. When he retired in 1994, Berthold Maria was recognized as the longest-serving soldier in the entire Bundeswehr. He married Mechthild Kunigunde, Gräfin von Benzel-Sturmfeder-Horneck in 1958 and settled in her family's home region in southern Germany, and the couple raised 3 sons together. In his later years, Berthold Maria became one of the most visible living links to his father's legacy, participating in the 60th anniversary commemorations of the July 20th plot in 2004, taking part in the opening ceremony of the Stauffenberg Memorial in Stuttgart in 2006, and speaking publicly, sometimes with pointed skepticism, about how his father's story was being retold for new generations. When the Hollywood film Valkyrie was announced in 2007, with Tom Cruise cast in the role of his father, Berthold Maria voiced open concern, noting Cruise's membership in the Church of Scientology and worrying aloud that the production risked turning his father's sacrifice into what he called horrible kitsch. It was a small but telling glimpse into how personally the Stauffenberg children continued to guard their father's memory, even 6 decades after his death. Heimeran Schenk, Graf von Stauffenberg, born July 9, 1936, in Bamberg, was the second of Claus and Nina's children, only 8 years old when the Gestapo tore his family apart. Heimeran's life after the war stands in sharp contrast to the public prominence of his elder brother and, as we will see, his younger brother as well. He largely avoided the spotlight that fell on other members of the family, choosing a quieter, more private existence away from the military career, political office, and public commemorations that came to define so much of the rest of the Stauffenberg family's post-war public life. He never married and had no children. What details survive of his adult life suggest a man who preferred to let the rest of his family carry the public burden of the Stauffenberg name, content instead to live largely out of the historical record that has so thoroughly documented his siblings. Heimeran Schenk, Graf von Stauffenberg, lived a long life relative to his brother Valerie's tragically short one, eventually settling in Zurich, Switzerland, where he died on October 20, 2020 at the age of 84, the second-to-last surviving child of Klaus and Nina von Stauffenberg. His death received relatively little public attention compared to the commemorations that mark the anniversaries of his father's failed plot each July. A quiet ending for a man who had spent 8 decades carrying, however privately, the weight of what had happened to his family in the summer of 1944. Franz Ludwig Schenk, Graf von Stauffenberg, born May 4, 1938 in Bamberg, was the third of the 5 children and only 6 years old at the time of his father's death, meaning he had almost no direct memories of his father at all, and would spend much of his adult life instead defined by his relationship to his father's legacy, rather than to the man himself. Like his siblings, Franz Ludwig was swept into Siepenhaft custody at Bad Saxe, stripped of his name and separated from his mother for nearly a year during the war's final and most chaotic months. After the war, Franz Ludwig trained as a lawyer, working for a period as a jurist at the Munich-based engineering and defense firm Krauss Maffei, before turning to politics in earnest. He joined the Christian Social Union, the conservative Bavarian sister party to Germany's Christian Democrats in 1962, and rose quickly through its youth wing, serving as deputy federal chairman of the Junge Union from 1969 to 1973, during a period of considerable ideological ferment among West Germany's youth. After an unsuccessful run for the Bundestag in 1972, Franz Ludwig was elected to the West German Parliament in 1976, representing Bavarian constituencies for the CSU until 1987, and he subsequently served in the European Parliament from 1984 to 1992, overlapping his final years in the Bundestag with his new European role. Throughout his political career, Franz Ludwig positioned himself as a guardian of his father's specific vision of the resistance, one rooted in conservative, patriotic and Christian values, rather than in any broader left-wing or communist opposition to Nazism. This became a matter of considerable public controversy in 1994 during the 50th anniversary commemorations of the July 20th plot, when Franz Ludwig publicly objected to plans that would honour, alongside his father and the military conspirators, German communists who had fought against Hitler within the ranks of the Soviet-organised National Committee for a Free Germany. He argued that these communists, however genuine their opposition to Hitler, had ultimately sought to replace one dictatorship with another, and that conflating their ideological commitment to Soviet-style single-party rule with his father's commitment to restoring German constitutional government blurred an important moral distinction. The demand drew considerable support, including from the West German defense minister at the time, but also drew criticism from those who felt Franz Ludwig was narrowing the memory of German resistance to fit a specifically conservative political narrative. Franz Ludwig married Elisabeth Freien von und zu Guttenberg, whose family included prominent figures in Bavarian conservative politics, and the couple had 4 children. Through his mother's side of the family, like his siblings, Franz Ludwig could claim a surprising royal connection, as a 4th cousin of the future King Charles III of the United Kingdom, a reminder of just how deeply intertwined the old European aristocracy remained, even after 2 world wars had swept away most of its formal political power. Now, in his late 80s, Franz Ludwig remains one of the family's most prominent and outspoken keepers of his father's memory, a lawyer and politician who spent his career translating his father's act of resistance into a specific, conservatively inflected vision of what it meant to have opposed Hitler for the right reasons. But not every one of Klaus and Nina's children lived to see old age, and the story of the 4th child is the saddest of all 5. A reminder that even for a family that had already survived concentration camps, executions, and a coordinated campaign to erase its very name, tragedy was not finished with the Stauffenbergs, Valerie Ida Huberta, Caroline Anna Maria Schenk. Gräfin von Stauffenberg was born November 15, 1940, in Bamberg, the only daughter among the 4 children present at Lautlingen on the day of the assassination attempt, just 4 years old when the Gestapo came for her mother and great-uncle. She endured the same ordeal as her brothers, the loss of her name at Bad Saxe, the separation from her mother, the uncertainty of whether her family would survive the war's final chaotic year. Unlike her brothers, Valerie did not pursue a public career in the military or in politics. On April 4, 1964, she married Heino von Lestock, a union that, like so many in the old Stauffenberg circle, connected 2 families with deep aristocratic roots in the Prussian and Baltic German nobility. But her marriage was tragically brief. Valerie was diagnosed with leukemia, and despite whatever medical treatment was available in the mid-1960s, the disease proved untreatable. She died on June 4, 1966, in Munich, at the age of just 25, barely 2 years after her wedding. Of all the post-war fates that befell the Stauffenberg children, Valerie's is perhaps the most quietly devastating, precisely because it had nothing to do with the war at all. She had survived Sippenhaft as a toddler, only to be taken from her family a second time, 22 years later, by an illness that had no connection whatsoever to the political violence that had already stolen her father, 2 uncles, a great-uncle, a grandmother, and an aunt. Her death was a stark reminder that even a family that had endured the very worst that a totalitarian regime could inflict remained just as vulnerable as any other to the ordinary tragedies of illness and mortality. That leaves the 5th and youngest child, Constanze Schenk Gräfin von Stauffenberg, whose very existence is perhaps the single most extraordinary detail in this entire story. Born January 27, 1945, in a Nazi-run maternity facility near Frankfurt an der Oder, Constanze came into the world inside the custodial machinery of the very regime that had murdered her father 6 months earlier, delivered while her mother Nina remained a prisoner under Sippenhaft detention. She was, quite literally, born a hostage. Constanze had no memory whatsoever of her father, obviously, but unlike her older siblings, she also had no memory of the ordeal of Bad Saxe or the terror of those final wartime months, since she spent that period as a newborn infant, clinging to survival alongside her mother on chaotic evacuation trains and in makeshift hospital wards. She grew up, along with her siblings, largely in the household of her grandmother's family in Lautlingen and later in Bamberg, absorbing the family's history secondhand through the stories and, eventually, the careful silences of the adults around her. On April 8, 1967, Constanze married Dietrich von Schultes-Rechberg, a match that connected the Stauffenberg family to Swiss nobility and eventually led Constanze to settle in Switzerland. It was there, decades later, that Constanze made perhaps her most lasting contribution to how the world understands her family's story. In 2008, drawing on family papers, interviews and her mother's own recollections gathered before Nina's death in 2006, Constanze von Schultes published a widely praised biography of her mother, offering the first detailed book-length account of any of the wives connected to the July 20th plot. Critics praised the book for its intimate, unsentimental tone, one reviewer noting that Constanze wrote as a daughter, not as an academic, allowing the raw, emotional weight of the material to carry the narrative without excessive editorializing. Through that book, Constanze ensured that her mother's quieter, less celebrated form of courage, the courage of enduring Ravensbrück while pregnant, of giving birth under guard, of being abandoned in a village by an indifferent policeman, and somehow finding her way back to her children, would take its place alongside her father's more famous act of defiance in the historical record. It is worth stepping back at this point to place the Stauffenberg family's ordeal within the wider context of what Sippenhaft actually meant for the broader circle of July 20th conspirators, because the Stauffenbergs, as prominent as they were far from alone in suffering this particular form of collective punishment. Karl Friedrich Goerdeler, the civilian leader designated to become chancellor, had the coup succeeded, saw his own family targeted, and his son Christian had already been killed in action on the Eastern Front years earlier, an unrelated tragedy that nonetheless meant Goerdeler's remaining relatives faced Sippenhaft custody without even that son's presence to comfort them. Henning von Treschow, one of the earliest and most determined organizers of the military resistance, took his own life on the Eastern Front rather than risk capture and interrogation, and his family too was swept into the Sippenhaft net, despite his death having already deprived the Gestapo of a living target to torture for information. Adam von Trott zu Solz, a diplomat deeply involved in the civilian resistance, was executed in August 1944, and his relatives endured their own version of the imprisonment and interrogation that had become standard practice by that point in the war. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's case is perhaps the most instructive point of comparison, because Rommel, implicated by Hofacker's torture-extracted confession, chose to take poison rather than stand trial, and one of his explicit motivations, according to his own account to his son before his death, was the certain knowledge that a public trial and conviction would doom his wife and son to exactly the kind of Sippenhaft ordeal the Stauffenbergs had already endured. By choosing suicide, dressed up by the regime as a fatal illness with a full state funeral, Rommel spared his own family the worst of what Sippenhaft could inflict. A grim calculation that speaks volumes about just how effectively Himmler's kin liability policy had succeeded in terrorizing not just the conspirators themselves, but everyone who loved them. Taken together, these cases illustrate that the assault on the Stauffenberg family was not some isolated act of particular cruelty reserved for the man who had actually planted the bomb, but rather the deliberate, systemic application of a policy explicitly designed to make any future conspirator think twice, not for fear of his own death, which most of the July 20th plotters had already accepted as a likely outcome, but for fear of what would happen to the people he loved most. What made Sippenhaft particularly monstrous, and what set it apart even within the broader catalogue of Nazi atrocities, was its explicit rejection of individual culpability, the idea, foundational to virtually every legal system with any claim to justice, that punishment should attach to the person who committed a crime, and not to their relatives. The principle of nulla poena sine culpa, no punishment without guilt, is so fundamental that it was later explicitly enshrined in West Germany's post-war constitution, the Basic Law, specifically to outlaw any future revival of Sippenhaft-style collective family punishment. That constitutional safeguard exists today in no small part because of what happened to families like the Stauffenbergs, the Hofackers, the Goerdelers, and dozens of others in the final desperate year of the Third Reich. It is a strange kind of legacy, but a real one. The suffering inflicted on Claus von Stauffenberg's wife, children, brothers, mother, and cousins helped shape, however indirectly, the legal architecture that modern Germany built to ensure such collective punishment could never again be inflicted by the German state on its own citizens. The post-war reckoning with what had happened to the July 20th conspirators, and by extension their families, was neither swift nor straightforward. In the immediate aftermath of the war, West German public opinion remained deeply divided about how to regard men like Claus von Stauffenberg. For many ordinary Germans, raised for over a decade on Nazi propaganda and steeped in a military culture that prized unconditional obedience, Stauffenberg and his fellow conspirators were, at least initially, still viewed by a significant portion of the population as traitors who had stabbed the fatherland in the back during a desperate war, rather than as heroes who had tried to save Germany from a criminal regime. It took years of deliberate public education, memorial building, and generational change before the July 20th plotters achieved the status they hold in Germany today, that of the moral conscience of a nation that otherwise struggled for decades to fully reckon with its Nazi past. The Bendler block, the very courtyard in Berlin where Claus von Stauffenberg was shot by firing squad on the night of July 20th, 1944, was eventually transformed into the German Resistance Memorial Centre, established in 1980, and the street on which it stands, once known as Bendlerstrasse, was renamed Stauffenbergstrasse in his honour. It is a striking piece of historical irony that the address where Stauffenberg died trying to overthrow Hitler now bears his own name, a permanent marker of how thoroughly Germany's official memory culture eventually came to embrace what he tried and failed to do. Nina von Stauffenberg lived to see much of this transformation unfold, watching her husband's reputation evolve from wartime traitor to post-war national hero over the 6 decades of her own life following his execution, a slow vindication that came far too late to spare her, her children, or her husband's brothers from the suffering the Sippenhaft years inflicted on all of them. It is worth pausing to appreciate just how singular Melita's pre-war career had been, because her achievements as an engineer and aviator stand out even by the standards of a country that, however grudgingly, did allow a handful of exceptional women into its aviation industry during the interwar and early Nazi years. In 1936, Melita performed an aerobatic display piloting a Heinkel Her-70 Blitz monoplane at the Berlin Summer Olympics, a high-profile demonstration of German aeronautical prowess staged before an international audience just as the regime was working hard to project an image of technological and cultural sophistication to the wider world. She held qualifications across an extraordinary range of aircraft categories, from gliders to multi-engine planes, and had developed particular expertise in instrument flying for night and poor weather conditions. Skills she continued refining through specialized courses, even as the political noose was tightening around her own family due to her father's Jewish ancestry. Her scientific contributions extended well beyond piloting alone. As a trained engineer, she conducted fundamental research into dive bombing sites and instrumentation, essentially helping to solve some of the technical challenges that made the Luftwaffe's Stuka dive bombers so devastatingly effective earlier in the war, work that placed her squarely at the intersection of cutting-edge aviation science and the machinery of Nazi Germany's war effort, an uncomfortable position for a woman whose own extended family faced persecution under the very racial laws her military value helped her evade. She completed a master's-level dissertation in 1944, receiving top marks even as her husband's family was being torn apart around her, a testament to her ability to compartmentalize her professional life from the escalating personal catastrophe unfolding within her own household. Nina's own experience of Gestapo interrogation in the days immediately following her arrest deserves a somewhat fuller account as well, because it illustrates the particular psychological cruelty the regime employed against women connected to the July plot. Pregnant, recently separated from her 4 young children, and uncertain whether her husband was even still alive at the moment of her initial questioning in Berlin, Nina was subjected to repeated rounds of interrogation designed less to extract useful intelligence, since she had genuinely been kept ignorant of the plot's specific mechanics, than to break her psychologically and extract whatever fragmentary information she might possess about her husband's associates, correspondence, or state of mind in the weeks before the assassination attempt. It was during this period of interrogation that she found herself in one of the more remarkable small human moments recorded from this entire ordeal, comforting Rosa Tellman, wife of the imprisoned Communist Party leader Ernst Thälmann, in the corridors or holding cells of Gestapo headquarters, two women from utterly different political backgrounds and social classes, one an aristocratic army wife and the other a lifelong communist militant, united in that moment purely by their shared status as hostages of the same murderous regime. It is a detail that complicates any simple narrative of the July 20th conspirators as an isolated aristocratic clique disconnected from the wider suffering the Nazi regime inflicted across German society. A reminder that Sippenhaft, whatever its specific application to the Stauffenberg family, was simply one especially systematic expression of a much broader machinery of terror that had already been grinding down political dissidents of every background for over a decade by the time Nina encountered Rosa Thälmann in a Gestapo holding cell in the summer of 1944. Let's return now to the extended family, because the Stauffenberg name did not stop with Klaus's immediate household, and the third generation, the grandchildren of Klaus and Nina, along with the children of Berthold and Alexander, offer a fascinating window into how a family carries forward the weight of a history like this one across multiple generations. Berthold Maria's own three sons grew up in a household where their grandfather's bust sat in the family living room alongside photographs from a childhood spent in Sippenhaft custody, a physical reminder present in daily life of exactly what their family's name had cost. His eldest son, Claus Philipp Schenk, Graf von Stauffenberg, born in 1959 and named directly after his grandfather, went on to marry and have children of his own, extending the Stauffenberg line into a fourth generation that would grow up even further removed from the direct trauma of 1944, yet still shaped by the family's now deeply institutionalized role as custodians of German resistance memory. Franz Ludwig's own four children likewise grew up under the shadow, or perhaps more accurately the mantle, of their grandfather's legacy, their father's decades in the Bundestag and European Parliament, ensuring that the Stauffenberg name remained continuously associated, generation after generation, with a very specific narrative of conservative patriotic resistance to totalitarianism. Berthold, Klaus's executed brother, was survived by his own two children, Alfred Klaus Maria, born in 1937, and Elisabeth Caroline, born in 1939, both of whom endured their own version of the Sippenhaft ordeal as young children before growing up in post-war Germany, carrying their father's name, a name that had been strangled at Plötzensee prison on their uncle Klaus's account as much as their own father's direct involvement in the plot. Alfred Klaus Maria lived until 1987, dying at the age of 50 in Berlin, while his sister Elisabeth Caroline married an Italian named Piero Roberti and, like several of her Stauffenberg cousins, built a life at some remove from the intense public scrutiny that fell on the more politically visible branches of the family. One question that naturally arises from a story like this one is how the Stauffenberg children, robbed of a father they barely knew and subjected to a year of terror as small children, actually processed what had happened to them as they grew older. The answer, based on the interviews Berthold Maria in particular gave in his later decades, suggests a complicated mixture of pride, grief, and a very deliberate effort to ensure the family's suffering was never used to diminish the moral clarity of what their father had attempted. Berthold Maria spoke candidly, in interviews conducted around the 60th and later anniversaries of the plot, about the shattering effect of first learning, as a 10-year-old, that his beloved father, a man he remembered as unfailingly cheerful despite his frequent absences at the front, had tried to kill the head of state. This was so shattering for me that I don't think I was able to think clearly again for the rest of the war, he recalled decades later, describing how the family's absolute trust in a father who was our absolute authority collided catastrophically with the accusation that he had committed treason against Germany. It took the children years, well into their teens in some cases, to fully absorb the truth their mother had initially concealed from them, that their father had not made some catastrophic error in judgment, but had instead acted with extraordinary moral courage against a regime that was, by the summer of 1944, already deep into the industrial murder of millions of people across occupied Europe. That gradual reckoning, moving from confused shame to informed pride, mirrors in miniature the broader transformation that West German society itself underwent over the following decades, as the July 20th plotters shifted in the national consciousness from traitors to heroes. There is a broader moral complexity here worth sitting with for a moment, because the Stauffenberg family's story resists easy categorization even as it inspires. Claus von Stauffenberg himself was not, in his younger years, any kind of committed anti-Nazi. Like his brother Berthold, he had initially welcomed Hitler's rise to power in 1933, and according to his own interrogation testimony, had at one point broadly endorsed elements of National Socialist racial ideology, even as he came to regard its most extreme applications as excessive and self-defeating. It was only the accumulated weight of years of criminal conduct, disastrous military decisions, and the regime's increasingly obvious moral bankruptcy, witnessed firsthand by Stauffenberg during his service on the Eastern Front, that pushed him toward active resistance, and even then his motivations blended patriotic concern for Germany's fate with genuine moral revulsion at the atrocities being committed in his country's name. This complexity does not diminish the courage of what he ultimately did, courage that cost him his life and inflicted a year of terror on everyone who shared his blood or his name, but it does complicate any effort to render the Stauffenberg story as a simple morality tale. Claus was not a lifelong crusader for democracy who finally got his chance to strike a blow against tyranny. He was a conservative, aristocratic career military officer who came, gradually and at enormous personal cost, to recognize that the regime he served had become an engine of unprecedented evil, and who then paid for that recognition and made his entire family pay alongside him, with almost unimaginable suffering. That same complexity extends to how we should think about Nina's role in all of this. Nina knew, in broad terms, that her husband despised the Nazi leadership and shared serious doubts about the war, yet she was deliberately excluded from the specific planning of the assassination, a decision made not out of any lack of trust in her, but explicitly to protect her and the children in the event the plot was discovered, which, of course, it was. This raises an uncomfortable but important historical question. Did that deliberate exclusion actually protect Nina and the children in any meaningful sense, or did the Nazi regime's Sippenhaft policy render such careful compartmentalization essentially pointless, since ignorance of the plot's details provided no defense whatsoever against collective punishment? The evidence suggests the latter. Nina's genuine lack of detailed knowledge did nothing to spare her from Ravensbrück, and Alexander's complete and total ignorance of his brother's plans did nothing to spare him from Dachau. Under Sippenhaft, guilt was assigned by bloodline, not by evidence, which meant that the conspirators' careful efforts to shield their families through compartmentalized secrecy were, in the end, a moral gesture of protectiveness rather than a practical strategy that actually worked. It's also worth acknowledging how the Stauffenberg family's post-war prominence and relative privilege shaped the way their story has been told and remembered compared to other Sippenhaft families whose names are far less familiar today. As members of the old German aristocracy, with connections stretching from Bavarian nobility to the British royal family through Nina's Lerchenfeld line, the Stauffenbergs possessed social and cultural capital that helped ensure their story was documented, published, and eventually memorialized with a thoroughness rarely extended to less prominent victims of Nazi terror. Berthold Maria's decades of interviews, Constanza's best-selling biography of her mother, the family's continued presence at official state commemorations, all of this reflects not just the objective historical significance of what Claus von Stauffenberg attempted, but also the family's particular position within German society, a position that gave them access to publishers, journalists, and official platforms that most Sippenhaft victims never had. This is not a criticism of the Stauffenbergs, who suffered genuinely and whose story deserves to be told, but it is a useful reminder that the historical record of Nazi terror is inevitably shaped by whose voices had the means and the standing to be heard, and that for every well-documented Stauffenberg child, there were countless other Sippenhaft victims, relatives of less famous conspirators, whose suffering left far fainter traces in the historical record. Let's turn now to the physical spaces connected to this story, because the places themselves carry their own weight of memory. Lautlingen, the family's rambling country house in the Swabian Alps where Nina and the children spent that fateful summer of 1944, remains today part of the extended Stauffenberg family's holdings and has become something of a pilgrimage site for those interested in the July 20th plot, its grounds and family crypt serving as the final resting place for Nina, for Melita, and for other family members whose lives were consumed by the events of that year. The house at Berlin-Wannsee, where Klaus and his family lived before the war, and the apartment on Tristanstrasse, where Berthold hosted conspiratorial meetings, both carry their own layered histories within the broader geography of the German resistance. Plötzensee prison in Berlin, where Berthold and Caesar von Hoffacker were both executed by slow strangulation months apart, stands today as a memorial site, its execution chamber preserved as a stark reminder of the method and manner in which the regime chose to kill its most prominent political enemies. And Bad Sachse, the small Harz mountain town where dozens of resistance families' children were stripped of their names and held in collective limbo for the better part of a year, remains a quieter, less visited site, its role in this history known mostly to specialists and to the descendants of the families whose children passed through its doors. The Wolf's Lair itself, the East Prussian headquarters where Stauffenberg's bomb detonated on July 20, 1944, now lies in what is present-day Poland, near the town of Kętrzyn, its bunkers and ruins preserved as a historical site that draws visitors interested in walking the ground where the most famous assassination attempt against Hitler actually took place. Berthold Maria Schenk, Graf von Stauffenberg, was invited back to that site in July 2004 for the 60th anniversary of his father's attempt, an emotionally fraught pilgrimage for a man who had spent his childhood paying the price for what had happened there, standing decades later on the very spot where his father's act of defiance and his family's subsequent ordeal had both begun. To fully appreciate the scale of what the July 20th plot's aftermath actually looked like, it helps to step back and look at the raw numbers, because the Stauffenberg family's suffering, extraordinary as it was, represented only one thread within an enormous tapestry of Nazi retribution. Historians estimate that more than 7,000 people were arrested in the crackdown that followed the failed assassination attempt, and that somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 conspirators and suspected sympathizers were ultimately executed, many of them through the same slow strangulation method used on Berthold Stauffenberg and Caesar von Hoffacker. The People's Court under Roland Freisler became, in the final year of the war, an instrument of pure political theatre, its proceedings designed less to establish guilt through evidence than to humiliate defendants on the record before condemning them to death, often within the same day. Freisler himself would not survive to see the war's end. On February 3, 1945, while presiding over a session of the People's Court, an American bombing raid struck the courthouse directly, and Freisler was killed, crushed by falling masonry as he attempted to flee to a shelter while, according to one persistent though disputed account, still clutching a case file in his arms. Many who had suffered under his courtroom saw a rough justice in the manner of his death, though it came, of course, far too late to save the men and women he had already condemned. The comparison with other prominent resistance families adds further texture to how we should understand the Stauffenbergs' particular ordeal. Freya von Moltke, wife of Helmuth James von Moltke, the aristocratic lawyer who led the Kreisau Circle resistance group and was executed in January 1945, endured her own version of wartime terror and post-war widowhood, though her husband's group had focused more on planning for a post-Nazi Germany than on the specific mechanics of assassination, meaning her family's Sippenhaft experience, while still harrowing, unfolded somewhat differently than the Stauffenbergs. Marion York von Wartenburg, married to Peter York von Wartenburg, Klaus's own cousin and a fellow July 20th conspirator, executed at Plötzensee just weeks after Berthold, likewise survived her husband's death and lived on for decades afterward as a public voice for the memory of the resistance, eventually becoming a judge in post-war Berlin and living to the remarkable age of 98. These women, like Nina von Stauffenberg, occupied a particular and painful position in post-war German society, widows of men who much of the country initially regarded with suspicion or outright hostility, who nonetheless outlived that stigma to become, in their later decades, respected keepers of a memory that West Germany only gradually learned to honour properly. It is worth noting that this slow, halting process of national reckoning did not happen automatically or naturally. It required decades of deliberate effort by historians, journalists, surviving family members, and eventually German political leaders across the spectrum to move Stauffenberg and his fellow conspirators from the margins of national memory to its very centre. Opinion surveys conducted in West Germany during the 1950s revealed a startling and uncomfortable truth. A significant portion of the population, in some surveys reportedly closer to half, still regarded the July 20th plotters unfavourably, viewing them through the lens of wartime propaganda that had painted them as cowards and traitors who undermined Germany's war effort at a moment of national crisis. It was not until the 1960s and beyond, as West Germany's political culture matured and as a new generation came of age with less direct emotional investment in the wartime narrative of national unity, that Stauffenberg's reputation began its full transformation into the heroic status he holds today. The 2008 film Valkyrie, directed by Bryan Singer and starring Tom Cruise as Claus von Stauffenberg, brought this history to a global audience in a way no previous dramatization had managed, though, as we noted earlier, the production was not without controversy within the Stauffenberg family itself. Beyond Bertold Maria's concerns about Cruise's religious affiliation potentially trivializing the material, the German government initially hesitated over granting permission to film at actual historical locations, including the Bendler Block courtyard where Claus was executed, given sensitivities about a major Hollywood production, backed by an American movie star with an unconventional religious background by German standards, dramatizing one of the most sacred episodes in the country's resistance history. Permission was eventually granted, and the film went on to achieve solid commercial success and generally respectful reviews, introducing millions of viewers outside Germany to a story that had, for decades, remained comparatively obscure beyond specialist historical circles in the English-speaking world. Whatever reservations family members expressed beforehand, the film undeniably expanded global awareness of exactly what Claus von Stauffenberg attempted, even if, inevitably, a 2-hour dramatization could only hint at the extended, agonizing aftermath that consumed his wife, his children, his brothers, his mother, and his cousins for the better part of a year after the credits would have rolled. Nina von Stauffenberg's own post-war life deserves a fuller accounting here, because her decades of quiet work after 1945 represent one of the less told dimensions of this story. Rather than retreating entirely from public life, Nina became involved in efforts to foster reconciliation and mutual understanding between defeated Germany and the American occupying forces who had, after all, been the ones to liberate her from Sippenhaft custody in the war's final chaotic weeks. She raised her 5 children largely as a single mother, managing what remained of the family's estate at Lautlingen and later at Kirchlauter, while gradually watching West German society's attitude toward her late husband shift from suspicion to reverence over the ensuing decades. She gave occasional interviews, but generally avoided the kind of extensive public commentary that her son, Bertold Maria, and in his political career, her son, Franz Ludwig, would later provide. Those closest to her described a woman who carried her grief privately, who never remarried despite living another 62 years after her husband's execution, and who found her deepest satisfaction in watching her children build lives and families of their own out of the wreckage that Sippenhaft had made of their childhoods. When Nina died on April 2, 2006, at the age of 92, she had outlived her husband by nearly 62 years, long enough to see the Stauffenberg name transformed from a byword for treason into one of the most honoured surnames in modern German history, long enough to see a memorial centre established at the very site of her husband's execution, and long enough to see her own daughter begin the process of documenting, in the biography that would be published 2 years after her death, the full scope of what she herself had endured to keep her family alive. One aspect of the Sippenhaft ordeal that rarely receives the attention it deserves is the material and financial dimension of the family's punishment, because Nazi retribution against the Stauffenbergs was never purely a matter of imprisonment and execution. Following the failed plot, the regime moved swiftly to confiscate the family's property, seizing bank accounts, personal possessions, and portions of the Lautlingen estate itself under laws that allowed the state to strip enemies of the people of virtually everything they owned. For a family that had built its identity over centuries around land, lineage, and inherited wealth, this financial dispossession added yet another layer of humiliation to the physical and psychological suffering already being inflicted. In the years immediately following the war, the family faced the slow, bureaucratically exhausting process of seeking restitution from a fledgling West German state, still working out exactly how it would compensate victims of Nazi persecution. A process complicated by the fact that much of Germany itself lay in ruins, and that competing claims for restitution, from Holocaust survivors to political prisoners to bombed-out homeowners, vastly outstripped the resources available to address them. The Stauffenbergs eventually recovered a portion of what had been seized, enough to allow the family to maintain its presence at Lautlingen and rebuild something resembling their pre-war standard of living. But the process took years and served as a persistent, grinding reminder of everything the family had lost in the space of a single catastrophic summer. The conditions Nina endured at Ravensbrück also deserve fuller description, because the camp where she spent months of her pregnancy was not some minor detention facility, but one of the deadliest concentration camps in the entire Nazi system, specifically for women. Established in 1939, Ravensbrück held somewhere in the range of 130,000 women over the course of the war, subjecting them to forced labor, medical experimentation, chronic starvation, and, in its final months, systematic executions as the SS attempted to destroy evidence of the camp's crimes ahead of the advancing Red Army. Estimates of the total death toll at Ravensbrück range from 30,000 to as high as 90,000 women, depending on the historical source and methodology used. Nina von Stauffenberg was held there as a Sippenhaft prisoner rather than as a labourer destined for the camp's brutal work details, a distinction that afforded her marginally better treatment than the general prisoner population. But marginally better treatment at Ravensbrück still meant overcrowded barracks, inadequate food, minimal medical care, and constant uncertainty about whether she would survive to see her unborn child delivered, let alone raised. The fact that she carried a pregnancy to term under these conditions, and that both she and her newborn daughter survived a subsequent bout of infection contracted during a chaotic evacuation, stands as a remarkable testament to her physical endurance as much as her psychological resilience. Daily life at Bad Saxe, meanwhile, offers its own grim window into how the Nazi state handled the youngest victims of Sippenhaft. The children's home was staffed by caretakers under strict instructions to prevent the resistance family's children from bonding too closely with one another or with staff, part of a broader effort to ensure these children remained isolated, disoriented, and psychologically unmoored from any stable sense of identity or belonging. They were given minimal information about their circumstances, told only that their surnames had changed and that questions about their parents were not to be asked. Bertold Maria later recalled the strange, artificial normalcy the staff attempted to maintain, complete with regular schooling and daily routines, layered awkwardly over an undercurrent of constant surveillance and unexplained absences, as children were periodically moved between different facilities, or, in isolated cases, quietly removed altogether when the Gestapo determined a family's usefulness as hostages had run its course. The psychological toll of this manufactured limbo, months of not knowing whether one's parents were alive, dead, or somewhere in between, has been the subject of subsequent scholarly interest in the long-term effects of childhood trauma among the Sippenhaft generation, research that has found lasting patterns of anxiety, hypervigilance, and complicated relationships with authority among many of the surviving children who passed through Bad Saxe and similar facilities during those final, desperate months of the Third Reich. The Uexküll-Gyllenband side of the family, the maternal line that produced both Klaus's mother Caroline and his executed uncle Nicholas, suffered its own extensive losses under Sippenhaft that rarely make it into the more commonly told version of this story. Nicholas von Uexküll-Gyllenband left behind 2 daughters and a son of his own, cousins to Klaus and his brothers, and these children too were caught up in the Gestapo's sweeping interpretation of collective family guilt, though their specific individual fates are less thoroughly documented in the historical record than those of Klaus's own children, a reflection of exactly the kind of documentation gap discussed earlier, in which prominence and public visibility shaped whose suffering became part of the widely told narrative and whose remained comparatively obscure. What is clear is that the Uexküll-Gyllenband relatives endured months of detention and interrogation alongside their Stauffenberg cousins, swept up in the same dragnet that had claimed Nicholas himself, distant enough from the plot's actual planning to have had no meaningful knowledge of what was coming, yet close enough in blood to be treated by the regime as equally culpable. The Stauffenberg Memorial in Stuttgart, whose 2006 opening ceremony Berthold Maria attended alongside former German President Richard von Weizsäcker, stands today as one of several institutional efforts to formalize and preserve the family's place in German historical memory. Located in the city where Berthold Stauffenberg was born and near the region where the family's ancestral roots run deepest, the memorial complements the larger German Resistance Memorial Center at the Bendler Block in Berlin, together forming a kind of institutional infrastructure of remembrance that simply did not exist in the first decade or two after the war, when the family's suffering was still a matter of private grief rather than public commemoration. The annual ceremonies held every July 20th at the Bendler Block, attended by senior German government officials, including, in recent decades, the Chancellor and the Defense Minister, represent the culmination of this decades-long process of transforming Stauffenberg from a controversial, divisive figure into the closest thing modern Germany has to a universally honoured symbol of moral courage under totalitarianism. It is a transformation that Nina, Berthold Maria, Franz Ludwig, and the rest of the family lived to witness unfold gradually across their own lifetimes. A slow vindication purchased at a price that began with Claus's execution in a Berlin courtyard and extended through a full year of terror inflicted on everyone who shared his name or his blood. What then should we make of this story, of a single act of resistance that cost one man his life and subjected an entire extended family, wife, children, brothers, mother, cousins and in-laws to a systematic campaign of imprisonment, deprivation and, in several cases, death? There is no way to tell this story that fully resolves its central moral tension. That Claus von Stauffenberg's choice to act, a choice history has vindicated as courageous and necessary, nonetheless imposed catastrophic suffering on people who never made that choice themselves, who in several cases, like Alexander and his young children, had no knowledge whatsoever that the choice was even being made. This is not a flaw in how the story has been told. It is simply the nature of resistance under totalitarianism, where the machinery of collective punishment ensures that no act of individual conscience can ever remain individual in its consequences. The Stauffenberg family's ordeal stands as perhaps the starkest illustration available of exactly what that machinery could do, and exactly what it cost the people who found themselves caught within it, whether or not they had ever shared the convictions or even the knowledge of the man whose name they carried. There remains one more thread of this story worth following closely, and that is the question of how the surviving Stauffenberg family members chose, individually and collectively, to relate to Germany itself in the decades after the war, because their choices on this front varied just as much as their individual life paths did. Berthold Maria's decision to join the Bundeswehr as soon as it was founded in 1956 was, in a very real sense, a direct continuation of his father's project, an assertion that the proper response to what the old German military had allowed itself to become under Hitler was not to reject military service altogether, but to help build a new army explicitly grounded in the principle that soldiers owe their obedience to law and conscience, not blind loyalty to whoever happens to hold power. The Bundeswehr itself formally adopted this principle, known in German military doctrine as innere Führung, or leadership development and civic education, drawing direct inspiration from the July 20th conspirators example, as it built an entirely new military culture from the ashes of the Wehrmacht's catastrophic moral failure. Franz Ludwig's path into electoral politics represented a different but complementary continuation of the same underlying commitment. A belief that Germany's post-war democratic institutions needed defenders who understood, from painfully direct personal experience, exactly what happens when those institutions collapse into dictatorship. Even Heimrun's quieter, more private path and Constanza's eventual work as a biographer represent their own forms of engagement with the family legacy. One through simple, deliberate withdrawal from public life, and the other through the patient work of historical documentation, ensuring that Nina's own courage did not disappear from the records simply because it lacked the dramatic, single-moment clarity of her husband's act at the Wolf's Lair. It is worth asking, too, what became of the wider circle of people connected to the Stauffenberg family through friendship and shared conviction, rather than blood, because the July 20th conspiracy was, after all, a network, and networks by their nature extend outward through relationships that don't always show up cleanly in a family tree. General Friedrich Ulbricht, who worked alongside Stauffenberg at the Bendler block and was executed the same night, left behind his own family, who endured their own version of Sippenhaft custody. General Erich Fellgiebel, the communications officer whose job it had been to cut off the wolf's lair from the outside world in the crucial hours after the bomb detonated, was tried alongside Berthold Stauffenberg on August 10, 1944, and executed that same day at Plötzensee, his family swept into the same machinery of collective punishment. Werner von Haften, Stauffenberg's young adjutant, who was executed alongside him in the Bendler block courtyard on the night of July 20th itself, was only 35 years old, and his relatives too faced Gestapo scrutiny in the weeks that followed. The sheer breadth of this network and the correspondingly wide net that Sippenhaft cast across dozens of extended families underscores just how enormous the human cost of the July 20th plot's failure actually was, extending far beyond even the substantial suffering endured by the Stauffenbergs themselves. Let us also address directly a question that inevitably arises when telling this story. Was it worth it? Did Claus von Stauffenberg's attempt, which failed to kill Hitler and which triggered a year of terror against everyone who shared his name, actually accomplish anything beyond the suffering it caused? Historians have debated this question extensively, and the honest answer is layered. In purely military and strategic terms, the July 20th plot failed completely. Hitler survived, the war continued for another 9 catastrophic months, and the Nazi leadership used the failed coup as a pretext to tighten its grip on the German military even further, replacing the traditional military salute with the Nazi salute across the entire armed forces, and eliminating what little institutional independence the officer corps had retained. But in moral and historical terms, the plot's significance transcends its immediate strategic failure. Stauffenberg and his fellow conspirators demonstrated, at a moment when it would have been far easier and far safer to simply comply, that resistance from within the highest ranks of German society was possible, that not every officer, not every aristocrat, not every institution had been fully captured by Nazi ideology. That demonstration became, in the decades after the war, an essential pillar of West Germany's ability to construct a national identity that acknowledged the horrors of the Nazi period, while still asserting that something within German culture and German institutions had resisted, however belatedly and however imperfectly. Whether that historical and moral significance was worth the suffering inflicted on Nina, on the 5 children, on Berthold, Alexander, Melita, Caroline and Nicholas, is ultimately not a question historians can answer with any confidence, because it requires weighing incommensurable things, a nation's long-term moral self-understanding against the concrete, immediate suffering of real individual human beings, who never chose the price they were forced to pay. What is beyond dispute is the sheer scale of what this one family endured within the span of roughly 12 months. A husband and father shot by firing squad. A brother strangled slowly on a meat hook while cameras rolled for Hitler's private viewing pleasure. Another brother imprisoned in a concentration camp despite having committed no offence whatsoever. A sister-in-law shot from the sky while flying supplies to keep her captive relatives alive. A mother dead of typhus in an SS camp. An uncle executed for the crime of encouraging his nephew to save his country. A wife imprisoned at one of the deadliest camps in the entire Nazi system, while 7 months pregnant, forced to give birth behind prison walls, abandoned in a village by an indifferent policeman, and somehow surviving to find her way back to 4 children who had spent nearly a year believing they might never see her again. And 5 children themselves, the eldest just 10 years old, stripped of their name, separated from every adult who loved them, narrowly spared from transport into a concentration camp that had already claimed so many of their relatives, purely by the accident of an Allied bombing raid disrupting the SS's transport schedule. It is difficult to imagine a more comprehensive assault on a single family's existence, and yet, remarkably, the Stauffenbergs did not merely survive this ordeal. They rebuilt, they raised new generations, they served in Germany's new democratic institutions, they wrote the history down so it would not be forgotten, and they lived to see the very name that Himmler had vowed to extinguish down to the last member become instead one of the most honoured surnames in the entire history of German resistance to tyranny. Nina von Stauffenberg's grave at Kirchlauter, Melita's resting place in the family crypt at Lautlingen, the memorial that now bears the family name on the very street in Berlin where Klaus was shot. the biography Constanza wrote to ensure her mother's courage would not be overshadowed by her father's more famous act. The 38 years Berthold Maria spent in uniform, proving that a new kind of German soldier could exist. The decades Franz Ludwig spent in Parliament, defending a specific vision of what genuine resistance to tyranny should mean. Even Heimeren's quiet, private decision to simply live his life outside the spotlight his siblings occupied. All of these represent different answers to the same underlying question. How does a family carry forward the memory of an act of extraordinary courage that cost it almost everything? There is no single correct answer, and the Stauffenbergs across 2 subsequent generations now have tried nearly all of them, from public commemoration to private withdrawal, from military service to political advocacy, to quiet historical documentation. What unites all of these responses is a shared refusal to let the Nazi regime's ultimate goal, the complete extinction and erasure of the Stauffenberg name, and everyone who bore it, actually succeed. Himmler wanted this family destroyed down to the last member. Instead, 8 decades later, the name Stauffenberg is taught in German schools, inscribed on street signs, honoured at annual state ceremonies, and carried forward by great-grandchildren who never knew Klaus, Nena, Berthold, Alexander or Melita personally, but who grew up understanding exactly what those 5 people and the 6th generation that came after them endured and ultimately overcame. There is one final figure whose fate deserves mention here, not because he was a Stauffenberg by blood or marriage, but because his own end illustrates the strange, almost vengeful logic that governed the Nazi regime's final months, and because he was the man directly responsible for Claus von Stauffenberg's death. General Friedrich Fromm, Stauffenberg's own commanding officer as head of the replacement army, had known for months that his chief of staff was involved in a conspiracy against Hitler and had quietly tolerated it, calculating that he would align himself with whichever side ultimately prevailed. When the coup collapsed on the night of July 20th, Fromm moved with impressive speed to cover his own tracks, having Stauffenberg, Olbricht, Haften and Merz von Quernheim shot by firing squad within hours, ostensibly under the authority of a hastily convened court-martial that legal historians have since concluded had no genuine legal standing whatsoever. Fromm's haste to execute the very men who could have testified about his own foreknowledge of the plot did not go unnoticed. Joseph Goebbels reportedly remarked to him afterward, with evident sarcasm, that he had been in a damned hurry to get your witnesses below ground. It did Fromm no good. He was arrested the very next day, and although the People's Court could not conclusively prove he had actively participated in the conspiracy itself, it convicted him of cowardice for failing to report what he knew. As a still-serving general, Fromm was spared the meat hook and piano wire that had killed Berthold Stauffenberg and Caesar von Hoffacker, granted instead the comparatively honourable death of execution by firing squad. He was shot at Brandenburg-Gurden prison on March 12, 1945. Less than 2 months before the war's end, the very man who had ordered Claus von Stauffenberg's own execution, ultimately consumed by the same machinery of Nazi vengeance he had tried so desperately to appease. Peter York von Wartenburg, Klaus's cousin through the extended aristocratic network that connected so many of the July 20th conspirators to one another, offers one final point of comparison worth noting before we close. A leading figure in the Kreisau Circle resistance group and deeply involved in the practical planning of the Bendler Block coup attempt, York was arrested alongside the other Berlin conspirators and tried before the People's Court on August 8, 1944, just 2 days before Berthold Stauffenberg's own trial. He was convicted and executed that same day at Plötzensee, one of the earliest of the more than 200 conspirators to die in the months of executions that followed the failed plot. His wife, Marion York von Wartenburg, endured her own period of Gestapo interrogation and Sippenhaft scrutiny in the aftermath of her husband's execution, though she was never subjected to the extended concentration camp imprisonment that Nina Stauffenberg endured. Marion went on to live an extraordinarily long life, eventually training as a lawyer and serving as a judge in post-war Berlin, and she became, alongside women like Nina and Freya von Moltke, one of the most important living voices connecting post-war German generations directly to the moral legacy of the July 20th resistance. She lived until 2007, 1 year after Nina von Stauffenberg's own death, having spent more than 6 decades as a widow carrying forward the memory of a husband executed for trying to save Germany from itself. Nina's own side of the family paid a price in this catastrophe too, a detail that is frequently overshadowed by the more extensively documented suffering of the Stauffenbergs themselves, but that deserves acknowledgement here. Nina had been born Elisabeth Magdalena Frein von Lerchenfeld, the only child of Gustav Freiherr von Lerchenfeld, a Bavarian nobleman and career diplomat who had served as a German general consul in the years before the war, and Anna Elfriede von Stackelberg, a Baltic German noblewoman descended from an old Estonian aristocratic line. Nina's elderly mother, Anna, was among those swept up in the wave of arrests that followed the July plot, and while accounts of the precise circumstances vary somewhat between sources, the most consistent record holds that Anna von Lerchenfeld died in detention in 1945, the same catastrophic year that claimed Caroline von Stauffenberg to typhus, some accounts placing her death specifically in a camp administered amid the chaos of the Eastern Front's final collapse. Nina's father, Gustav, died that same fateful year of 1944 as well, though his death appears to have been connected to the broader upheavals of the war's final phase, rather than to direct Sippenhaft execution in the way that claimed Berthold Stauffenberg and Nikolaus von Uexküll. Taken together, this meant that by the time Nina was finally reunited with her surviving children at Lautlingen in the summer of 1945, she had lost not only her husband and two brothers-in-law from the Stauffenberg side of the family, but both of her own parents as well, an almost incomprehensible accumulation of grief compressed into a single 12-month span, absorbed by a woman not yet even 32 years old who still had 5 children, depending entirely on her for whatever stability and love could be salvaged from the wreckage. The story of the Stauffenberg family did not stop unfolding once the immediate post-war reunion at Lautlingen concluded and the family began, slowly, to rebuild. Anniversaries have continued to mark the passage of decades, each one prompting renewed public attention to exactly what this family endured. The 80th anniversary of the July 20th plot, observed in 2024, brought a fresh wave of documentaries, newspaper retrospectives, and official commemorations across Germany, with surviving family members and their descendants once again called upon to share memories that, with each passing year, become rarer and more precious as the generation that actually lived through Sippenhaft as children continues to age and inevitably to pass away. Berthold Maria Schenk, Graf von Stauffenberg, born in 1934, remains, as of the time of this video's writing, one of the last living direct witnesses to what happened to this family in 1944 and 1945. A man now in his 90s whose childhood memories of Lautlingen, Bad Saxe, and the long, uncertain wait for his mother's return represent an increasingly irreplaceable thread connecting the present day to one of the most consequential and harrowing episodes in the entire history of German resistance to Nazism. When his generation eventually passes, as it inevitably must, the responsibility for carrying this story forward will fall entirely to written records, to Constanze's biography of her mother, to the archives of the German Resistance Memorial Center, and to educational institutions across Germany that have made the July 20th plot, and its devastating aftermath for the Stauffenberg family, a central component of how the country teaches its own children about the moral choices available even under the most totalitarian and terrifying of circumstances. It is also worth considering how the story of the Stauffenberg family compares to the fate of ordinary Sippenhaft families whose names never entered the history books at all. While the Stauffenbergs, the Hoffackers, the Yorks, and the other prominent conspirator families connected to the July 20th plot have been extensively documented, interviewed, and memorialized over the 8 decades since the war, the Sippenhaft policy's reach extended well beyond this circle of aristocratic and military elites. Ordinary soldiers accused of desertion or defeatism in the war's final year saw their own families threatened and, in numerous documented cases, actually punished under the same expansive interpretation of kin liability that Himmler had unveiled in his Posen speech following the July plot. A February 1945 decree explicitly extended Sippenhaft threats to the relatives of any military commander who surrendered a position Hitler considered indefensible. A policy grimly illustrated when the family of General Otto Lasch was arrested after he surrendered the besieged city of Königsberg to Soviet forces that April, with the arrests publicized in the Nazi Party newspaper, Völkischer Beobachter, as a warning to any other commander contemplating surrender. These lesser-known Zippenhaft cases, involving families with no aristocratic titles, no access to sympathetic journalists or publishers, and no surviving children who would grow up to become generals, parliamentarians, or published biographers, have left far fainter traces in the historical record. Their suffering known today mostly through scattered archival references and specialist academic research, rather than through the kind of rich, detailed family narrative available for the Stauffenbergs. This disparity is worth keeping in mind as a final note of historical humility. The story told in this video, however extensively documented and however genuinely extraordinary, represents only the most visible tip of a much larger, much less thoroughly recorded landscape of Nazi collective punishment that likely touched thousands of German families in the war's final catastrophic year, most of whose individual stories will now never be fully recovered. The German Resistance Memorial Center at the Bendler Block today houses an extensive permanent exhibition documenting not just the mechanics of the July 20th plot itself, but the fates of the conspirators' families in considerable detail, including original documents connected to the Sippenhaft arrests, photographs of the children's home at Bad Saxe, and personal testimonies gathered from surviving family members over the decades since the war's end. Visitors to the courtyard where Stauffenberg was executed can view a bronze memorial plaque and a statue commemorating the conspirators, while the museum's exhibition rooms trace the broader network of resistance activity that connected figures like Stauffenberg, Jörg von Wartenburg, Trott zu Solz, Goerdeler and Treschow into a loose but determined coalition of officers, diplomats, and civilian officials united by their shared conviction that Hitler's regime needed to be destroyed from within. The museum's careful documentation of the Sippenhaft aftermath, rather than treating the conspiracy story as ending with the executions of July and August 1944, reflects a deliberate curatorial choice to ensure visitors understand that the July 20th plot's true cost extended far beyond the men who were shot, hanged, or strangled in its immediate aftermath, reaching into the lives of wives, children, siblings, parents, and cousins who bore no responsibility for the plot itself, yet suffered its consequences just as directly. One last comparison is worth drawing because it sharpens exactly what made the Stauffenberg family's suffering so distinctive within the broader catalogue of Nazi atrocities. Unlike the millions of Jewish families, Roma families, disabled people, and other victims the regime targeted for who they fundamentally were, the Stauffenbergs were punished specifically for what one member of their family had done, an act of deliberate, conscious political resistance rather than an accident of birth or identity. This distinction matters historically because it means the Stauffenberg family's suffering, while genuinely catastrophic, occupies a different moral category than the industrial genocide the regime was simultaneously carrying out against Europe's Jewish population. A genocide that was reaching its most intensive phase in the very same months, mid-1944, when the Sippenhaft arrests were unfolding at Lautlingen and Bad Saxe. Auschwitz-Birkenau was still receiving and murdering hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews, even as Nina von Stauffenberg sat in Ravensbrück awaiting the birth of her fifth child, a grim juxtaposition that underscores just how vast and multi-layered the Nazi regime's machinery of terror had become by the war's final year, capable of simultaneously running an industrialized extermination program against an entire people, while also devoting substantial resources to the more narrowly targeted, though still genuinely brutal, punishment of a single aristocratic family for one man's act of conscience. Before we close, it is worth reflecting one final time on just how narrow the margins of survival actually were for this family. Because so much of what allowed the Stauffenberg children and their mother to live through 1944 and 1945 depended on circumstances entirely outside their control. Had Melita's sympathetic Gestapo contact not tipped her off to her relatives' locations, the family's imprisoned members might have received no supplies at all in their final desperate months of captivity. Had the American bombing raid near Nordhausen not disrupted the SS transport schedule that spring, the four eldest Stauffenberg children might well have been moved into Buchenwald itself in the war's final chaotic weeks, a camp where mass executions of prisoners continued literally until the moment of liberation. Had the indifferent policeman escorting Nina and her infant daughter chosen to actually complete his assignment rather than abandon them in a village out of simple weariness with the war, Nina might have ended up at Schönberg alongside the other Siepenhaft hostages the SS was still holding as potential bargaining chips, or worse, potential targets for last-minute reprisal killings as the regime collapsed. Had American forces liberated the Harz region even a few weeks later than they did, the calculus facing the SS guards at Bad Saxe and at the various prisons and camps holding the rest of the family might have shifted toward exactly the kind of vengeful, last-ditch massacres that claimed the lives of concentration camp prisoners elsewhere in Germany during those final desperate days. The Stauffenberg family's survival, in other words, was not simply a matter of resilience or courage, though they possessed both in abundance. It was also in no small part a matter of luck, of timing, of small human kindnesses from strangers, and of the sheer chaos of a collapsing regime that, mercifully, ran out of time before it could finish carrying out Himmler's explicit vow to extinguish this family down to its very last member. In the end, perhaps the most fitting way to close this account is to return to where we began, with a briefcase and a bomb, and to recognize that everything which followed, the executions, the concentration camps, the stolen names, the birth of a child behind prison walls, the fatal flight of a decorated test pilot trying to save her husband, was set in motion by a single colonel's decision that Germany's moral survival mattered more than his own physical survival, and more, in the end, than the safety of the people he loved most. Claus von Stauffenberg surely understood, on some level, the danger his family would face if his plot failed. What he could not have known was just how far the regime's vengeance would actually reach, how many lives beyond his own it would claim or shatter, or how many decades it would take before history rendered its final verdict that his sacrifice and the suffering it imposed on everyone who shared his name had ultimately been worth the price. History, for whatever it is worth, has answered that question generously in Stauffenberg's favour, even if the answer came far too late for Nina, for Berthold, for Alexander, for Melita, for Caroline, for Nicholas, and for the 5 children who spent the final desperate year of the Second World War, not knowing whether they would ever see their family whole again. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this deep dive into the extraordinary and harrowing story of Claus von Stauffenberg's family informative. If you enjoyed learning about what happened to Nina, Berthold Maria, Franz Ludwig, Valerie, Constanze, and the rest of the Stauffenberg family after the July 20th plot, make sure to check out our video on what happened to the children of Nazi leaders after World War II, where we explore how the sons and daughters of figures like Himmler, Bormann, and Göring lived in the shadow of their father's crimes, a story that offers a striking contrast to the Stauffenberg children's experience of being punished not for their own father's crimes, but for his act of resistance against them. You might also want to watch our video on what happened to the wives of Nazi leaders after World War II, which follows women like Emmy Göring and Magda Goebbels through their own very different post-war reckonings, and which stands in stark contrast to Nina von Stauffenberg's story of imprisonment and survival, not because of complicity with the regime, but because of her husband's courageous stand against it. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. See you in the next one, and thank you again for taking this journey with us through one of the most remarkable and heartbreaking family stories to emerge from the entire history of the German resistance to Hitler, a story of loss, endurance, and quiet vindication that took more than 60 years to fully unfold. A vindication that began the night Claus von Stauffenberg fell in a Berlin courtyard and did not truly conclude until his widow, his children, and his grandchildren had spent the better part of a century ensuring the world would never forget what their family had sacrificed.